everybody, I want to welcome you back to Far From Normal's online art class. I'm so excited about how many of you joined me last week, and I really appreciate all the feedback that I've gotten from everybody, so I just want to thank you all for that. I also want to tell you that if you want to make sure you keep up to date on every time a class is posted, if you want to subscribe to my YouTube channel or go visit my blog, you can subscribe via Twitter or email or Facebook, and that way you'll know every time a new class is posted, so you're sure not to miss out on anything. Today we're going to take the shading lesson that we did last week and we're going to apply it so that we learn how to shade objects to make them look a little more realistic. What you're going to need today is a pencil, once again a nice wooden pencil, not a mechanical one. Also an eraser and a pencil sharpener will be handy. There's also 4 worksheets today that you can go to my blog and download and print. They're pretty simple ones, but we're going to need all 4 of them to get started. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is shapes and forms. I know you probably all know your basic shapes, and a lot of you probably know your basic forms too. But we're going to talk about them in less of a math way and more of an art way. Most of the time when we're learning about shapes or forms, we learn about them in math class. But what we're going to talk about is how they look from an art perspective, because most things that we look at are made up of basic forms. We're going to talk about that later, how to combine them. But for today, we're going to look at the forms and we're going to look at how light hits them, how we can shade them to make them look three-dimensional, and just how to make things look a little more realistic. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over our 2D shapes and our 3D forms and talk a little bit more about what that exactly means. So we'll start with a circle. Circle is a pretty simple one. It's a very simple shape. So that's our 2D shape. When we say 2D, we mean that it has 2 dimensions. It's something that's flat because it just has a height and a width. It doesn't have any depth. It doesn't stick out. This is completely flat. But if we look at its counterpart, which is the 3D version of it, which is the form rather than the shape, this has depth. It has, it sticks out. You can see that it's got 3 dimensions to it. So for a circle, its 3D counterpart is a sphere, which, like I said, a lot of you probably know that, but we're going to go over it anyway. And then we're going to move on, and we have our square. So probably a lot of you know what I'm going to say next, which is the square's 3D counterpart is a cube. So we can really look at this and understand the idea of it having a width and a height and a depth. We have a third corner here that we don't have with this plain flat one. So we have our square and our cube. So the third one we're going to talk about is the triangle. So the triangle's 3D counterpart is a cone. And you can think of an ice cream cone, a street cone, a party hat. You also may be familiar with a pyramid, which is also triangular, but for the sake of this art activity, we're going to look at the cone as the 3D counterpart to a triangle. And then we have our rectangle. Now, a rectangle is another one that you may look at this and you may be familiar with a rectangular prism. When we're talking about art and shading, that really falls into the cube category. A rectangular prism is going to get shaded just like a cube. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, that's okay. But for those of you that are in a little bit more advanced grades, you've probably studied these things, and so I just want you to understand what I'm talking about. So we're going to look at the rectangle, and we're going to look at its counterpart, which is a cylinder. And I have a funny cylinder to show you. You probably all have one of these cylinders in your house. Round on the top, round on the bottom, and straight in between. I also have a little one because we have to understand that all of these forms come in a variety of shapes and sizes. So we have a big one and then we have a little one. Also round on the top and the bottom and straight in the middle. So what does all this mean as far as drawing goes? Well, you can take something that looks flat And if you shade it correctly, you can make it look three-dimensional. So what we're going to learn about is how to take our shading and how to apply it to a two-dimensional paper and make it look like a three-dimensional form. So the first thing that I'm going to show you is we're going to do a little demonstration here. And I'm going to show you light. Because when we're shading, we have to think about light, where our light is coming from, how it's shining on our three-dimensional object, and what it's going to look like. So we're going to start with the cube, and I'm going to try to give you a little demonstration of how the light hits it. So we have our cube, and it's sitting here in the dark. And if we turn a light on to shine on it, you can see how this light is going to hit it on the top, and it's a lot brighter. Over on this side, it's going to be a lot darker because that's not where the light is hitting it. And on this side, it's going to be kind of medium. And then, of course, it has a shadow, which is super dark. Depending on the angle of the light and where it's coming from, that's all going to change. So as we start shading, we're going to talk a little bit about imagining where our light is coming from. And so you can see the example on the cube. You can also see even a ball like this. It's going to have a real bright white spot, and then it's going to have a lot of darkness down here where the light is blocked by the ball itself, and so there's a lot of variation in our shading. So every single form has a place where the light hits it and where it's a little bit darker. Just like you can see here, it's a lot brighter over here, a lot darker over here. And then I'll do our cylinder too, just so you can see. And it's got the same thing happening, where a lot of it is dark, but part of it is also light. So part of shading is partly studying where the light hits and where it goes. Okay, so now we're going to work on the first worksheet that you'll need, and that's the one that has the forms all divided into sections. Learning to shade forms can be just a little bit tricky. So we're going to start out with this, and what it's going to do is it's going to help us to divide the forms into the different sections where it's going to be darker and lighter. What I want you to do is, like I said, it's important to remember where the light is coming from. So what I want you to do is draw a little arrow in the corner of your page like this. What that is representing for you is my flashlight, how I have my phone shining onto the forms. That's your light. So you can remember that's where your light is coming from. So you remember that this is going to be your lightest side, and then this is going to be your darkest side. So we are going to work through these. We're going to do the cone and the cylinder, and then there's also one for the cube and the sphere. The cube is probably the easiest, and the sphere is probably the trickiest. But we're going to go ahead and work through them. I'm going to show you guys how to do it, and that way you can do yours and you can practice going from light to dark on your forms. So we're going to start our shading with this paper that has the cone and the cylinder on it. Now, like I said, we're going to pretend that this is a light shining down from the corner. If you want, even you could draw a little flashlight and have its little beam shining down on your paper. So that way you remember where the light is coming from. So when we think about where the light's coming from, if it's coming from the top corner here and we know it's shining down, we know that this part right here is going to be the very lightest part of our cone. We also know then that this part is going to be the darkest part because it's the part that's not going to have much light reaching it at all. And then in between, these are going to just get gradually darker as they go around the cone. So that's how we're going to shade it. We're going to start with the very lightest over here and the darkest over here and do in between in varying shades. can see, even by shading that in sections, how it's starting to get a little bit more of a 3D effect. We're going to move on to the cylinder, and you're going to see how it does the same thing. When we look at the cylinder with its flat top, most of the light, the brightest part of the light, is going to hit the very top of this. So the top of your cylinder is going to be your lightest shading. And then once again, the light's going to be hitting over here. So this area is going to be the lightest, moving around the cylinder into the darkest area over here. So once again, we're going to shade from light to dark all the way around, just trying to get a little bit darker as we go. So there's our cylinder all finished. Once again, you can see how it's starting to take on a nice 3D shape just by shading it just in this way. So we're going to move on next, and we're going to work on our sphere and our cube. Now, like I said, the cube is pretty much the easiest one because it just has basically 3 different areas that we're going to be shading. If we're once again envisioning our light coming from up here, on our cube, it's going to hit the top, so that's going to be our brightest. A little bit's going to shine onto the front, so that's going to be our medium shade. And then this side over here is going to be our darkest. With our sphere, spheres are a little bit tricky because they're round, so their shading almost wraps around them. So we're going to start, our brightest spot is going to be right here where the light's hitting it. And then as it goes down, that shading is going to wrap around it till down here it's going to be the darkest because that part is starting to curve under. So once again, I'm going to show you guys how I do it, and you can go ahead and follow along. So now we've finished our sphere and our cube. Once again, you can see how much this is starting to look three-dimensional. The cube is a very simple one. Like I said, the top is your brightest, and the front is your medium shade, and the side is your darkest. So when we do our next project, the cube isn't going to change at all, whereas the other ones are going to. So now that we're done doing our shading in sections and we can see what parts are going to be the lightest and what parts are going to be the darkest, we are going to combine that on these sheets that don't have the divisions. With these, we're going to go from dark to light or light to dark, and we're going to blend it all together so that it makes our shapes nice and three-dimensional so that they look like they're popping out of the paper. Once again, I'm going to show you guys how I do this. I'm going to talk a little bit while I'm doing it so that you can understand a little bit more what I'm doing and how to make it look nice and smooth. So let's get started on that. Now we're going to start with our cone for our shading without our lines. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind as we start is that when you're shading, whether you decide to go from light to dark or dark to light, that's up to you. I personally like to start with the darkest area so I can lighten up as I go. You also want to keep in mind that you want your pencil strokes to follow the shape of your form. You don't want to have lines going up and down like this. You want to have them curve just a little bit because this is a curved shape. So you want your lines and your shading to sort of wrap around it. Let me show you what I mean as I do it, and that way you can understand a little bit more. As I start down here at the bottom, I'm going to go along with the shape of the cone. We're going to put the dark part in here, and then as I shade, you see how I'm going with the shape of the cone, not up and down or not straight across. We want it to be in a nice curved shape to help us with our shading and making it have that three-dimensional look. Okay, so there is our cone all shaded, and you can see how it looks like it's popping out of the paper. What I want you to also notice is if we put it up next to the one that we did in sections, how our shape of our different shading is just about the same on this one. It's just much smoother. So that's the effect that we're going to be going for on all of our forms as we're shading them. You can also always go back, like if you look at it and you think maybe it needs a little bit more here, maybe it needs to be a little bit darker. Like I taught you last week, you can always go back and go over your shading again to make it darker. What you want to make sure is that your light stays as light as you can get it, because that would be harder to lighten up. But you can play around with it. You can shade a little darker in some areas, and just see what kind of different effects you can get with your shading. So now we're going to work on our cylinder like we did when we did our one with the sections. We want to remember that if the light's shining here, then our top section is going to be the brightest. So that's going to get the lightest shading. Now also, like our cone, our cylinder has a round shape. So we want to follow the shape of our form so that we can help it to look more realistic and help that shading really look like it's wrapping around it. So we're going to start the same way I did with the cone, and I'm going to start with the dark. Like I said, it's a personal preference if you like to work light to dark or dark to light, but we're going to remember to really wrap our lines around the form rather than going up and down or straight across. We want to work with its natural shape to help it to look more three-dimensional. So now we're going to work on the sphere and the cube. These two are really the easiest and probably the hardest, I think. It might not be for you, but to me the sphere is the most challenging. The cube though was very easy, just like we did on the last paper. Our lightest area is going to be here, our medium area is going to be in the front, and our darkest is going to be here where not as much light is hitting it. Now with the sphere, I want you to take a look at the other paper we did and pay attention to how the shading curves around this sphere. You want to make sure you're looking at it as a ball and thinking about how the light wraps around it. Also that some of the areas of shading are going to be a little smaller or larger than others. Like I've said before, you can start with the light and work your way to the dark, or the other way. With the sphere, you might find that you want to work a little bit with the light, a little bit with the dark, and a little bit in between. Whatever works for you. I also want to say that I have shaded lots and lots of spheres, so when I do it, it's going to look like it's pretty easy, and you might do it and you might get a little frustrated because it's not as easy for you. I've had lots of practice, so I don't want anybody to get discouraged. I want you to realize that you might need to practice a little bit more. You might want to do another one. You might want to approach it a different way the next time. Just do your best and try your hardest, and just keep working at it, and eventually you'll get to where you can make it look easy too. So now we've finished all of our shading. Now you can see how shading can affect a two-dimensional object and make it look three-dimensional. If you want to continue practicing this throughout the week, you can print more of these papers off and go ahead and keep working on them. You can also do it with a colored pencil. That's kind of interesting too. You can do the same pressure that you do with a regular pencil using a colored pencil. So sometimes that makes it a little more interesting to practice. Next week, we're going to take everything we've learned so far, and we're going to combine all these forms and all this shading, and we're going to learn how to blend them together to draw actual objects. So what you're going to need for next week's class is just some plain paper and a pencil. You could also bring along some colored pencils because you can use them next week for what we're going to be doing. I look forward to seeing you all then. I hope you enjoyed this class. I hope you learned something new, and I can't wait to see you next week. Blah, 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 blah. Rewinding.
We'll wait for him.
Okay. So now that we've... All right.
Oh,
like you doing that. Okay. All right. Okay, so now you've got... Oh, I can't figure out what I'm trying to say, Nathan.
all right.
No, it's okay. Stop. I don't want to... Yeah, okay.
I just don't want to waste the memory.
All right. So now... Oh my God. Okay. I'm just not going to say so now.